All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Yasmine. I'm going to be doing a little talk today about authentic horror in visual novels. Okay. So first of all, hi. If you want to follow me, by the way, I'm on Soft, on itch.io as well as Blue Sky X, etc. And this talk is basically for anyone who's looking to create authentic horror in the visual novel games that they're working on. Just to give you a little perspective on me for the two games I'll be mentioning throughout this presentation is two solo projects that I worked on. It's called Is It Okay for Me to Live as well as The Trials Goodbye. So working in the team might be a little bit different depending on the team members you have and what they want to work on. So a lot of this is more focused on personal introspection and things that you personally want to tell when you're creating your hopefully dream horror visual novel. But just to kind of get started, I'm going to just kind of give you a run through of horror visual novel games. If you haven't gotten the chance to play any, this will give you like just a little snippet of like what's out there, what you should be looking for. But horror visual novel games are just like any other horror games. They're interactive fictional works that tend to scare, disturb, or alarm the players. A variety of subgenres here: psychological horror, body horror, Lovecraftian horror, meta horror, Dempa horror, and many much more. But obviously, don't feel this need to constrict yourself to any one of these genres. A lot of times, these genres tend to overlap a lot. You'll see if you go on VNDB on any game, you'll see a ton of different tags. So again, just don't what is it? Don't feel constricted by what games you enjoy, what kind of games you want to create. At the end of the day, it's important to make something that feels true to you. But to just kind of give you a little run through everything, we have the psychological horror genre using mental psychological states in the game in order to disturb the player and create an unsettling atmosphere. You'll see this actually overlap with a lot of the other subgenres I'll be mentioning, and it tends to be the most popular due to this accessibility. And I have examples here like Fata Morgana, Higurashi, as well as Chaos Head. When we're talking about body horror, these are a subgenre of horror visual novel games that feature very graphic textual and visual descriptions of gore and body violations. I won't go too deep into this one, but there is a lot of these are some games that like gore screamy shows, Super Hibi, as well as Kara no Shoujo that feature them. We have Lovecraftian visual novels, which are inspired by the works of H.P. Lovecraft, featuring nihilistic cosmic horror. They erode the fabrics of reality and society and emphasize really this threat of the unknown, including this can include monsters, aliens, etc. And you might also you might hear it referred to as also eldritch horror. So we have like Maho Shoujo Mo Sensen, Slay the Princess, as well as Saya no Uta. We have meta horror, which is the one that you probably know the most about if you've played Doki Doki Literature Club, or maybe it's I say Japanese predecessor, but not really. You and Me and Her, and they tend to feature a variety of meta elements. Essentially, the game being very aware of itself in order to unnerve the players in unexpected ways. And then lastly, I have here Dempa, which means electromagnetic waves. These type of visual novel games were inspired by the Fukagawa street murders, and they cover themes of madness, delusion, conspiracy theories, etc., and they tend to usually also be psychological horror games. So I have examples here like Jisatsu no Tame, Sayonara Oshiete, and Sui no Sora. And just to kind of give like a little tidbit too, I know there's like popular games out there. It's like Slay the Princess and Doki Doki Literature Club, which have done a lot for horror visual novels. But if you actually compare the stats on VNDB, you'll see that it's horror visual novel games are not the most popular in comparison to drama, fantasy, or romance. It's only about 2,000-ish horror games probably out there, at least known, but a lot of this tends to be due to kind of the more explicit and darker content that they explore that tends to make them less accessible to a wider audience. But that's okay because when we make a horror visual novel, we're kind of making it a little bit for ourselves, aren't we? So let's talk about authentic horror and maybe the word authentic a little bit. What is authenticity? Is this if you look up on the dictionary or Wikipedia, it basically is a concept of personality that's true and congruent to a set of values and beliefs. Therefore, how do you determine the body of work like a game is authentic? Is it expression? Does it have to do essentially with the creator's authority? Is it cultural? Is it based on the background of the creator, their identity, how they were raised? Or is it experiential? Essentially, is it the experience of how you interacted with this bodywork? Is that what makes it authentic? And the real answer is that probably depends on you, and they're probably all right to a degree. Because that's like your opinion, man. Authenticity is a complicated thing to explain. It is very complicated to define. And it's been something that is constantly been debated about since ancient and Greek Roman times. When you're thinking about a piece of work that is authentic, you'll see there's a lot in comment sections, for example, like, oh, this feels really authentic to this era. This feels, like really genuine. But when you try to think about it logically, that means you have to have insight and judgment of the creator's authority, culture, the genre, and the environment it was presented in. And most likely, you probably won't know what is actually authentic unless someone tells you, right? At least, you can only use the best of your knowledge. And when we're saying the word something like authentic horror, that could be actually kind of a little difficult to find what makes something feel authentic. So I actually like to think about it in a little different sense. I actually like to more point it towards another term, relatability. And I didn't do that well at AP Calc, but that's okay because for me, I kind of see relatability as being equal to authenticity, which is the quality to make something understandable or be related to. Essentially, it helps the audience relate to the story that's being presented. So relatability really, in my opinion, should be, and everyone could have a little bit of a different consensus on this, but I think it should be our aim when we create a horror visual novel. It lends to this sort of credibility to the experience that are presented and ensures that we're really invested in the story as much as the characters are. Everything should make either logical or emotional sense when we're following the narrative. And especially too, when we talk about really uncomfortable topics and themes, things that tend to get under people's skin, we really want to make sure that these experiences feel relatable, not to everyone, obviously, but to a subset of people that may have undergone a similar form of trauma themselves. And this can be all through the presentation, what happens throughout the narrative, as well as, character interaction, how they talk to each other, how they behave. And so I have this little thing, I call it the prick method, but take it as any way as you want. But it just helps me kind of do a lot of brainstorming when I'm sort of figuring out my concept and how I want to develop it. When I'm thinking about how to make a game feel, my horror game feel relatable and in a way that feels like, deeply scary. And it's about essentially doing a lot of research, finding personal inspiration, thinking about the choices that the player or the characters in the game will be making, ensuring that every game feels like a conversation, and then knowing when to stop, putting the kibosh on it. So PRICK. So when we're talking about personal inspiration, I have a couple of questions here, and if you want to, feel free to jot them down. They, at least for me personally, they help me come up with ideas for my games in a way that feels more real. I could put a lot of more weight and effort behind. So I have questions here such as what makes you or a loved one afraid? What worries you? What makes you feel safe? What societal problems you or a loved one experiences, and what experiences have impacted you for the worse or negatively. And the reason I say these are great for brainstorming purposes is that they feel extremely personal to you and you are able to put the most thought and intent behind it. It could also include a loved one. The only reason I don't say to look at experiences of people that maybe you don't know very well or of celebrity figures is that you don't have as much of an investment in them in compared to someone like you or maybe a close friend of yours or a partner of yours. But also be aware a lot of this too will require a lot of self-introspection and looking deeply within yourself. And a lot of these questions too will help you drive the research that you're doing. Writing is going to always be a growing process. The creation of any visual novel game is always going to be a growing process. So a lot of this will change throughout the course of your project, especially solo projects in my personal experience. But these questions will sort of help you stay central to what you're working on and not deviate too far. So just like my short game, Is It Okay For Me to Live, which was a Windows 98 inspired visual novel that I made, I actually kind of ran through a bunch of these questions myself while I was on a trip to Baltimore and thinking about just things that were affecting me kind of late in 2024, stuff that made me afraid. It sounds simple, simple phobias, feelings of the eyes, eyes looking at me, fear of blood. fear of stalking, or maybe medication, things that worry me, relationships, friendships, the complicated like nature of like, trying to maintain a, proper friendship or relationship. What things that make me feel safe, like my bedroom. Weirdly enough, mirrors make me feel safe. Dolls and plushies, I can use that as potentially as a way to sort of contrast against the horror, or use it to create a false sense of security. Societal problems that I experience, loneliness, maybe even like societal misinformation, and experiences that have impacted me negatively, like friend fallouts, isolation, PTSD nightmares. And a lot of this is very personal, obviously, and when you're kind of going for this, it's not always the most pleasant experience, but it really does help it feel more genuine, so that when someone is playing for your game, they can also relate their own experience back to it. And that's where the relatability kind of comes in. Second one, research, part of the prick method. Pretty self-explanatory, but this will always ensure that you have better results. Your story is told a lot more effectively, and especially kind of as I mentioned previously, when you talk about very uncomfortable topics, you want to ensure that you talk about it properly. Like if you're on a like maybe a more light example, like what is anxiety, you want to understand what anxiety is, and you want to do your research on it properly, talk to people who may be experiencing it themselves, or doing even just like some Google searches, reading through books, and just learning about what it is to ensure that you're portraying it properly. But just like a bullet point list of like how to research, you can always gather visual references, taking photos, looking for illustrations, movies, games, and photos that you like, and collecting them. Even if you're, by the way, like not an artist in particular, you program, you write, storyboarding is always super helpful. You can always stick figure it. There's nothing wrong with that. But I find, at least personally for me, and everyone's a little different, writing itself is a little difficult when I can't exactly visualize what I'm trying to portray. In addition to examining contemporaries, too, playing games, watching movies, reading books, visual novels are awesome in the sense that they cover qualities of all three of these. So definitely, expand yourself. I mean, I play a lot of visual novels myself, but I also make sure I watch a lot of movies. I read a lot of different books, and I try to kind of take little tidbits of like, type of prose that they use, the type of dialogue they use. Researching the real world, of course, religion, literature, philosophy, world events, cultural phenomenons, time periods, even in my example of it's okay for me to live, conspiracies as well too, things that I might not know like for at the top of my head, but in doing so, learning about the real world, it kind of helps me bring more breath to the world that I'm trying to create. And touching grass, I mean, obviously living life, meeting people, exploring, taking as many risks as possible. You'll find a lot of really funny, interesting, and scary moments in your life through living life as honestly as possible, and allow you to tell your story more effectively. And I always highly recommend to research. When you're researching, just keep writing throughout the process. Like make sure, like at least for me personally, I like to keep writing drafts as I do my research, and I'll do things as simple as on Google Docs. I'll just straight up paste pictures. I'll like write like little comments and notes of like things I'm thinking about, and it lets me kind of, even if I don't run with that draft and I don't run with that version, I might come back later and kind of reword it, try to figure out ways to incorporate like my new notes or some of the references that I got. So this is just like a tiny little snippet. I'll probably breeze past this, but when I was thinking of it's okay for me to live, just some of the research I did. I mean, it goes all over the place. Like from I was looking at a clock tower in Baltimore while kind of being out of it and loopy. It sort of inspired some of the scenery that I wanted to incorporate. You know, being unfortunately in very gross kitchens, seeing like a lot of rust and all kinds of like bugs littered around it. Playing a variety of different games. I was really inspired by the Windows 98 era. I was watching a lot of playthroughs of Sui no Sora in particular on YouTube. And even like old animes that I've been inspired by, like Rosa Maiden, for example, I used that to inspire what the look of my character is, which ironically was very much different from my first draft where I described her in the thick, like black coat and the Ushanka. And much later, I decided to turn her more into like a Lolita style doll to both represent the era of Windows 98, like what was popular at the time, but also just create something a little bit more creepy and different, and kind of pointing back to what comforts me, dolls. Next, I'm going to be talking about interaction. And when I say the word interaction, I don't just mean, I mean anything related to choices, but not just choices that the player makes, which is, obviously that's an obvious one there, but also choices that the character makes as well too. I think choices, when you're thinking about them, they should feel like they have heavy plot implications or change the atmosphere in some way. It should change your feelings about these characters to some degree that creates this sort of tension and allows there to be a great like payoff. So in the next game, I'm talking about The Trials of Goodbye, which is the short GBA free visual novel that I created. Please check it out. It's a very short game, but the choices there force you to interpret situations differently depending on your answer, and you get a different reaction from Tala. The game at the beginning comes with the premise that you will be essentially giving her a judgment. You either can send her to heaven, hell, or purgatory. And through that, you start talking to her as she enters into her trial. You're the Grim Reaper, and you're here to kind of, talk to her a little bit before you give her your verdict. So the first two choices that you have in the game is the first one is whenever you tell Tala, the young girl, how she died or not. Your answer and how she takes it will depend whenever you see her in a little bit more of a positive light, a more negative light, neutral. The second one is lying or telling her the truth, essentially explaining how you as the Grim Reaper choose to judge a person. You could, in this case, choose how you want, if you want to tell her or if you want to lie. And that answer and how she takes it will also depend too. And usually enforces a more negative reaction out of her. Then comes the verdict, which is where the endings come in. You have heaven, hell, or purgatory, where you send Tala. This is the hot, heavy plot implication. There's no backing out now. Now that you kind of know where she stands and who she is, you have to give her your verdict. And then in the heaven or hell, once you get those endings, there are, a secondary choice at the end. It kind of lets you make a post-judgment call and see essentially if you as a player thought you did the right thing or not. And obviously your answer here and how she takes it depends. And though each choice here didn't necessarily change the ending, there's only actually really one choice that really creates like heavy like plot implications, so to speak. Each choice I put here is still meant to somewhat change the atmosphere in a way where you have a different interpretation of her, and because your goal is to give her a verdict, it really can change your feelings towards Tala at the end. Next point is going to be conversation. Since we're talking about horror, again, heavy, disturbing content, oftentimes we deal with dark psychological themes. It's really important that our games feel like conversations or dialogues, whether it's for the themes or content that we're presenting, or the choices that you as a character or you as a player or as the character you're following along is choosing. So we want to be sure that we're thoughtful in how we present everything and make it never feel like the player is being blabbed at the whole time or feel like that they're being like lectured to. They want to feel like that they themselves have put an investment into the story. First one is empathy. I think of the best horror games, it's always ones that can invoke empathy, not pity in this case, because you want to understand a character. But the story and character should always make some sort of emotional and or logical sense. The game will then therefore feel a lot more genuine. You can actually be invested. So even when in a game like that has like maybe it's a kinetic novel and it has no real choices, but if you understand where the characters are coming from, it's almost like you yourself are making a choice, especially in first person kinetic novels where you're following along with their thoughts and their feelings and their actions. What we previously discussed as well to research, ensuring the material recovering is as accurate as possible, especially of course when we're dealing with things that can be very quickly easily perceived as offensive or can be, unfortunately triggering for some people due to personal circumstances. By portraying it as accurately as possible, the players who's then going through the game and going through the experience will feel like essentially that the game was not only made with the best intent, of course, too, and being thoughtful in how it's choosing to present the topic, but it can also be, in a way, a little bit freeing, too. I know, at least personally for me, playing a lot of horror games, like some of the ones I've listed earlier, a lot of them helped me actually navigate my own personal feelings about like different relationships, my own mental health as well, too. So we want to make sure that it feels as accurate as possible and, to the best of our ability. And it essentially kind of goes back to relatability. We want to make sure that players always feel like they can relate to the character or the situations, at least to some extent. And then, of course, trigger warnings, but I also meant to include in here like age. age rating, content warnings, anything here to help players beforehand determine if the game isn't appropriate for them. There's like a little link there I have from the University of Michigan if you want to follow along. But, unfortunately, some experiences can be considered traumatizing enough or can re-trigger unfortunate memories. So we should allow players always the choice to decide if they want to basically engage with the experience or not to. And even in games that may be like more, so to speak, like surprising, like those that within the meta horror genre, usually will have some sort of preface like of some sort of maybe inappropriate or like horrific content that will be coming their way, even if it's not specific. So as long as we give these warnings, give this kind of warning to our players, they'll never, ideally, hopefully have to feel like that they're going through an experience that they didn't want to go through. And that's kind of part of creating this, so to speak, conversation or dialogue between us and the players. And then the kibosh, essentially it means to put a stop in Yiddish, but is sometimes I think we tend to go overboard ideas. I think as creators, whenever you're an artist, programmer, writer, whenever you're all three of them, like I am myself, we want to do a lot of different things, and it can kind of go deep and late into production, especially for my two projects here. It's okay for me to live in a trials goodbye. I was a solo creator, which meant I could do a lot of things that I wanted to do, and no one would essentially stop me. And a lot of times I don't want to be stopped, but it's important to because we don't want to confuse ourselves or the player. And also just thinking about it too from this perspective, you can't appeal to everyone. Every game has a market, but it doesn't mean you have to appeal to every single player out there and include every single idea just to make it relatable to the whole world. Essentially, it's okay to be a little more constrained here. We're working within horror visual novels, and they tend to be just a little less accessible than usual just due to the content they show. And I think that's totally okay. That's kind of part of the fun and joy of like the genre we're working in. But just things to consider as always: show restraint, leaving room for the big moments. And this includes aspects of art, writing, music. There was an advice I was once given by a writer where this was for writing a novel, but I think it really actually applies to all the visual novels, is every page you write should have I like to call it a fancy sentence, like a sentence with really great prose, something that will really leave an impact on the reader. And I think that really applies here for visual novels too. Not everything has to be a home runner, but there should be things that feel big or maybe feel more meaningful or impactful. And we should build up to that rather than trying to make everything we do super impressive. And this also ensures that any tension that we build up has its payoffs in the end. And of course, also, we want to make sure all the smaller ideas point back to the main concept. If you've taken any drawing classes, you might have heard the concept of big, medium, small when it comes to shape design and language. Same idea here. You want to make sure everything points back to that main concept and doesn't overstay its welcome. If it doesn't serve the concept, I highly recommend either taking it out or reworking it in a way where it'll be able to help supplement the big main idea, essentially. That we don't have to play that. I just put that there as an example. So just like an example of mine that I wanted to share was for the Trials Goodbye, actually. My original project was supposed to have 3 characters, actually. You were going to be the Grim Reaper, and you would be judging these 3 separate characters who had their own personal crime that they went through. There would also be like items that you would give them, and this would kind of change the sort of verdict and ending that you give them. And I had my character Tala, who is what's the only character that you do interact with in the final version of the Trials Goodbye. But as I was working through the game and I was creating the art and kind of doing the writing and trying to really cram this all in at the same time, I sort of thought about this, that Tala was the most impactful because of her backstory. Spoilers ahead. Basically, she's the last human on Earth, and unfortunately, she had to kill her family due to unfortunate circumstances of the world dying. And this kind of gave her the most characterization and like ability to relate to the Grim Reaper who in this case is intended to be the first person on Earth, and you as the player as well too. You're able to kind of relate a lot more to her and kind of be more empathetic to being in this sort of spotlight of being the first / the last human being on Earth. So by taking these 3 characters and cutting it down to Tala, I was actually able to make the game feel a lot more impactful with the kind of decision that you make. Because if you had to judge all 3 of them, then each decision you would make would probably feel a lot lesser, weigh a lot less, and would have less impact over time. But by keeping it focused on her, who was the most anyway related back to the original concept of being judged, as well as how she relates back to the Grim Reaper and you as the character. It kept the game and the story a lot more concise and a lot more clear. And now, summary time. Uh, these are all just like a little tidbits of like what I've just kind of previously talked about, but focusing on being relatable, of course, using personal inspiration and things that horrify you and left impacts on you, being mindful of all interaction choices that your players are making or the choices they'll be following along for kinetic novels. Every game, it's always focus on it being a dialogue, make sure the player is aware of what's to come. But of course, don't throw away your integrity. You're allowed to make games that you want to. That's the whole point of, being a creator and getting to make a horror visual novel. You're going to go into territories that maybe a lot of other games or just a lot of works of fiction may not, and that's totally all right. But also, restrain yourself too. You don't want to be too unfocused. Being detailed is great, and having a lot of depth in the content that you show is obviously always cool. You don't want to lose the bigger picture, and that tends to confuse you, the player, when you get too muddy with the details. And again, at the end, just have fun. It's as simple as that. You are making something really unique. You're making something that hopefully will personally speak to an experience related to you or to someone that you love, as well as doing a lot of research into the world that's around you, and picking up on references that maybe you normally wouldn't, and learning a lot more about yourself too as a person. Like I said, for Is It Okay for Me to Live, when I was creating that game, a lot of that process of like figuring out what was kind of like upsetting me at the end of like 2024 when I was on my trip through Baltimore. It gave me a lot of introspection of like what I wanted to do for the following year, and also, things that tend to upset me, I was able to kind of sort of put down on paper, even in this fictionalized world and setting of mine. But yeah, I hope you liked the presentation. Thank you, VNConference, for having me. This is my first talk I ever did. If you guys have any questions, I definitely love to hear them.
Cool. We'll take a couple of moments for questions. Hold on here. I think I saw a couple of scrolling back. There it is. Okay, so someone asked, authenticity is important to me for the sake of me, but can you explain why authenticity is important in horror and or storytelling in general? You spoke about research at length, and I've seen people weaponize things like historical accuracy against creators with perspectives and qualities similar to mine.
Okay, so the reason, let me go back just to when we're talking about, like personal inspiration, right? And we're like kind of used, and also worried about like, having the research that we're doing being used against us. I think number one thing to understand, and this is just something from my own personal experience, is that kind of as I previously mentioned, horror games tend to always run into the realm of being in like these sort of like it tends to run in a lot of topics that are usually not super socially acceptable. They may challenge a lot of ideas that we have about the world. And the reason I emphasize doing research is because the idea, I like to jokingly call it like, it's sort of like building the case around yourself. It's ensuring that you did your best effort into when you're describing like the different fears and experiences that you're going through, ensuring that you can be as accurate as possible. Hopefully that can appeal to like experiences like when I mentioned anxiety, like if you're doing your research on people who experience anxiety and you want to incorporate that as something within the game, you're going to want to make sure that, while your own personal experience is fine too, people experience anxieties in different ways. So knowing how they experience it could help you craft the story in a way that feels relatable to more people. But unfortunately, yeah, too, there is always going to be the chance of backlash, or hey, this doesn't exactly relate to me. Maybe this didn't feel authentic towards me. And I think there's no real good answer for that. A lot of the games that I actually previously mentioned, like during the beginning point of this project, a lot of them come with their own controversial topics. Most of these games are M-rated, feature extremely violent, sometimes sexual content, and it's going to always be a point of controversy, and there's always going to be discontentment from an audience that may not be, looking for that like type of experience, or people who maybe thought it was one thing, but it's not the other. And research is just really there to help hopefully mitigate that to the best of our abilities. Hopefully that answers your question, by the way.
All right. Okay, so we are coming up on time. So thank you so much for your talk. And the next speaker up is going to be Shino.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry. So I gotta say this up front, but I'm almost definitely gonna go a little over time since I actually kind of want to leverage the break time, but let's see what happens.
All right,
But
we have a break
anyways.
after this. We'll roll with it. It's cool.
Yep. Right. Yep. Let me start my own timers.
All right, I see your
And
slides. It's all yours.
cool.